So why Palestine, or how did you get connected to Palestine, or that issue?
Yeah, it's I have no. I mean, I was born in the Mediterranean Sea, in Malta, but I'm not a Jew and I'm not an Arab. I think the roots of that go to the fact that when I was in high school, and even when I was in college, I'd listen to the news and I'd read the paper, but I wasn't really focused on the Middle East. But what's interesting is through osmosis, from what I was getting from the media, I always associated Palestinians with terrorism or with terrorists. Because the only time, I realized later, putting it together, I realized the only time I ever heard the word Palestinian was in relationship to a hijacking or, attack on the Israelis. And that was sort of the perceived wisdom I got, and I never really questioned it. When I was in college, I thought of myself as a relatively smart guy, and I was kind of concentrated on Central America. And at some point, it was actually after I graduated from the university, it was around the time of the Israeli attack on Lebanon and the Sabra and Shatila massacres in Beirut. That's where Israeli forces had surrounded refugee camps, and Christian allies went in and killed a lot of Palestinians. That was the first time I thought, oh, I didn't realize Palestinians were victims in any sense. I always thought of them as the aggressor. So that was the first time things began to get a bit unsettled in how I looked at it. And I began to pay attention to the issue. And I began to read about it. And I spent a couple of years in Europe just talking to people, and Europeans have a more nuanced perspective. And at some point, I studied journalism. I began to sort of resent what I'd got from American journalism, because I realized there was another narrative. There was something else going on. Certainly, what you could say there was a context to what was going on, which I'd never got. And this was the journalism I'd studied, this objective journalism, which hadn't really given me what I needed to understand that situation. That's sort of the gist of how I got involved, and I think the main reason I really pushed it was the journalistic angle. Was, wow, this is what I studied, but it didn't give me what I needed. And that's when I thought, okay, well, maybe I'd like to see this for myself, and maybe I'll approach it in a different way.
I think you said somewhere in an interview that in your earlier work on Palestine, and maybe in your early visits, you were more a tourist than a reporter. I don't know if that's an accurate quote. And maybe it doesn't seem that way in retrospect, but.
Well, I didn't think of myself as a tourist, but I mean, to a large extent, let's just say I didn't know what I was doing a lot. I mean, I wasn't under the auspices of anyone, and no one was holding my hand going through it. So I went not knowing what. I mean, I knew somewhat of what to expect because I've done a lot of reading, but I'd never really spent time in the field, as they say. So I wasn't sure how to go about doing certain stories, and I was kind of meek and holding back. And then at some point, I just got a bit. I was there for 2 months, and at some point, you just say, okay, this taxi's going to Nablus. I'll just get in the taxi and let's see what happens. And I began sort of practicing what I began to call random journalism, which is, let's see what happens today. It wasn't. Later on, I began to fill in certain gaps I needed to tell a story, say the cutting down of olive trees or bulldozing of a home or something like that. But at first, what I did was just go to places, go to towns, get out of a taxi, and what I realized is someone was going to approach almost immediately and say, what are you doing here? And I just say, I'm here, I'd like to see your lives. I'd like to see what life is like under the occupation. And more often than not, in fact, almost 95% of the time, someone would say, come with me, I'll show you something. And then I just let that develop. So that's why on some level, I mean, if you read that first book I did, it's a little scattershot in some ways. I mean, perhaps that's part of its charm, but it was sort of a lot of accidental stories in a way.
It does cohere. So,
I hope it coheres, because at some point when I was there, I realized, okay, well, these people are talking about prison. I heard that story a lot. It seemed almost every Palestinian over a certain age, a male, had spent time in prison. So I thought I need to find out how to tackle this story. And there were like resource centers and things like that I began to learn about, that I called up, and they gave me some tips. You know, at a certain point I began to understand how to make a story work in the real world as opposed to, you know, for a class assignment.
Now, Footnotes in Gaza is, of course, much more focused, right,
Yeah.
on these incidents and these two massacres in 1956. Where did you first hear about these? I think you referred to, you saw some lines in a book by Chomsky, and then took it
Yeah.
from there. Is that right?
Yeah, I happened to be going to Gaza with the journalist Chris Hedges for Harper's Magazine, and he was going to write the story, and I was going to draw some illustrations. And I was kind of relieved, because that means he would be doing the real work, and all I'd be doing is drawing. Before we went, we decided we would focus on the town of Han Yunis, just to give ourselves a place. And I just seem to remember something I'd read in a Chomsky book. I think it was The Fateful Triangle. And it was about Han Yunis. And I looked it up, and it mentioned a UN document that talked about 275 people, Palestinian civilians, being killed on one day in 1956 during the Suez War. So I told Chris, well, if this happened to the town, and we're telling some of the history of the town, we should ask some older people if they can confirm this, if they remember it. And when we were there, we did indeed find out. We talked to some older people who remembered it very distinctly. Unfortunately, that was the part of the story that was cut out. And that's when I decided to actually focus on this and go back and really do a job on it. I was living in New York at the time, so I went to the UN archives, and I found the one document that refers to this particular episode, and another one in the town of Rafah about 10 days later, where 111 Palestinians were killed. So, and then I looked through the UN archives. I mean, I'm sure this is something you're doing all the time, but it was one of my first real experiences in an archive, and tried to assemble everything I could that was in documentary form before I did the trip myself. But that's really all I could find. That was it. That one document, which what it did was it said, the Israelis say this happened, and the Palestinians say that this happened. And having already talked to some Palestinians, I sort of figured the story wasn't, it might not have been either story really, but it certainly was. It didn't seem to be the Israeli version, which was that the Palestinians had been resisting. So I decided I'd like to make sure about this and talk to more people, and basically get to the bottom of it as much as I could.
Well, you obviously did prodigious research, and if it were within my power, I'd give you a doctorate on the spot for the kind of research embodied in that book. It's truly amazing, and I think the envy of historians. Well,
thanks. The hardest part was getting an Israeli side of it. I'm kind of curious about some of this sort of thing, because I don't, you read Hebrew and you read Arabic, which I think would be a tremendous advantage, because the disadvantage I felt I was at was, well, first of all, it seems highly unlikely that there are many Arabic sources for this. Egyptian sources would probably be closed. Israeli sources are, to some extent, open, but not speaking Hebrew, that was a difficult thing. So I had to hire a couple of researchers to have a look.
Right.
Now, you've spent time in...
Yeah, and it's spotty. I mean, I understand the problem that you faced, because of the Israeli archives have actually been a source of tremendously revisionist work, as I'm sure you know, on 1948 and a whole range of things. But they're not entirely open. There's certain things, especially things that relate to sensitive issues like this, that remain classified, that aren't accessible, or sometimes certain pieces of the archives have been open and other times closed, depending on who's asking. So I know you had people looking for things, and they didn't find very much ultimately.
They found some things, and some things that I thought were interesting. I mean, what they found was, what was interesting is that the subject of what happened, especially in Rafah, I'm not sure why Han Yunis didn't seem to come up. Maybe those are the documents that there was nothing on, but in the Knesset, there were some questions from Knesset members who seemed upset by some reports that were beginning to filter out in the press that were certainly not complete reports. And there was some explanation by Moshe Dayan, who was the top military Israeli officer, and Golda Meir. She had to answer to the UN in a letter, and David Ben-Gurion, who was the prime minister. Each of those three people each had an explanation which differed. I mean, Ben-Gurion's especially seemed to build on the other two explanations and add some new twist to it. I also talked to Israeli historians as much as possible, including Benny Morris, trying to see if they had any leads or if they could help me approach it in some way, if there was something I wasn't thinking of or somewhere I could turn to. That was a problem for me.